does, and the different research and intervention projects housed at CIS. We have always been deeply invested in understanding that the digital and the internet are new and old media simultaneously. While the things that we might be doing with the digital technologies might appear different or new or unprecedented, they work within a much larger ecosystem of lived reality and practice. The digital might offer modes of engagement, but the objects of engagement, the policy and legal environments within which they operate, and the socio-cultural codes that they subscribe to are much older than these technologies. Hence, in a lot of work that happens at Center for Internet and Society, we try to be reflective about the fact that media ecologies, media histories, and different models of usage, distribution, consumption, and regulation need to be incorporated in our understanding of the contemporary nature of technologies as well as their futures. So colleagues in the one program that we run called Access to Knowledge have been working on Wikipedia editing in local languages, but they concentrate on building models of Indian language education and knowledge to address historical contestations around language in India. Or the folks working on internet governance relentlessly work at understanding questions of censorship, piracy, authority, authenticity, and intellectual property, and realize that they are as old as human civilization histories. Researchers who have been collaborating with us on a project called CIS Researchers at Work program have demonstrated through histories of the internet that there are a wide range of problems and questions that have leapfrogged across technologies through history, and that the questions of internet's relationship with the society have to address these questions. That these are questions not only of the technological, but also of gender, of access, of rights, of free speech, and openness through multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholder environments. The India report, I think everybody now has a copy, but there are more copies available later. The India report on mapping digital media, supported by the Open Society Foundations, is a first of its kind study that situates digital media in history, in different media, in different sectors, and in between different regulation environments, to chart the landscape of digital media and how it shapes our contemporary negotiations of public policy, of regulation and innovation in India. So it's with the greatest of pleasure that I'm kicking off this evening just around an hour late and handing over to Vibodh. Thank you. You want this one as well?
Okay. No, it's fine. Stick it wherever. I have to go there. Thanks for this, Nishant. And yes, I think welcome everybody. For me, it's been a privilege and a big learning to sort of grow with this organization. I didn't know anything about the internet when I started on the board of this organization. So as the programs which Nishant has talked about have grown, so has my kind of knowledge and awareness of what the I in CIS stands for. What has also been interesting is that the kind of worlds which I inhabit, largely dealing with broadcasting and with news in particular, seems to have over the years come closer, both in terms of the themes and concerns with what CIS is sort of dealing with in terms of its core areas. And I think one way in which this sort of closeness has emerged is in terms of trying to understand what were earlier different sectors. So there's a world of telecom, which is complete in itself, or it was thought to be. There's a world of broadcasting radio, which is again thought to be complete in itself. And then of course there's a world of newer technologies like the internet. And I think the birth of CIS in a sense seems to have been at this very interesting moment where these different worlds seem to be sort of coming together. Inside CIS, I know there have been sort of significant conversations on how the implications of one world might unfold on the other. What does that mean to research, education, teaching, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, also kicking off this study of mapping digital media came at a moment where three things came together. One, of course, was the sense of what were different sectors in the communication industry, how they are coming together. B, as far as the policy world was concerned, one was able to try and see very clear vacuums in these three sectors, and therefore the implications of one vacuum on the other one. And thirdly, common challenges, specifically what the report brings out in terms of the lack of data on these three sectors themselves. Of course, there's different ways to understand this, what Nishant calls the ecosystem around these three sectors, and of course the more sort of meso level ecosystem encompassing all these sectors. I think in his own research cluster at CISRAW, trying to understand more in terms of human interactions, the relationship between humans, information technologies, and so on and so forth. I think what Pranesh and Nirmata are doing are trying to sort of look at it more in terms of how it affects our lives at a more immediate kind of level, and to try and shape the way in which these processes tend to affect our lives. A few sort of comments on the report itself, and then there are sort of some key points which I want to make, starting off with the title of the talk itself. We started off this report about a couple of years ago. I'm very happy that Siddharth Narayan from ALF, who's also one of the co-authors of the report, is here as well. When we started sort of, this report is part of a large, sort of over 50 country studies looking at this digital transition. So in a sense, it's interesting that one is trying to look at transitions within different countries, and at the same time trying to map these transitions in a comparative way across different countries. And in a sense, a large amount of data which has been accumulated over these 50 reports. Three things in a sense which I would like to sort of flag off as far as what is emerging out of these reports. One, of course, is a strong sense of the way in which our media environment, especially the news environment, has got heavily politicized. The second issue deals with the nature of our, what we call a public broadcaster, or often is called the state broadcaster. Where does it stand in this milieu of transition, in this milieu where you have more and more private enterprise growing, often at the cost of public and state enterprises? What does that mean? And of course, thirdly, in the explicit realm of cable television or commercial television, what are the kind of transitions happening in terms of digitization? Yeah, closer. Okay. We have been sort of hearing quite often about the way in which, when we talk about news, television news, there are two thoughts which immediately come to our mind. One, of course, is that despite the increasing number of channels and languages, it all looks the same. And therefore, as to why, with the increase in the number of channels, what we are seeing appears to be more and more similar across languages. The other sort of track which becomes quite significant and also easily observed is this whole sphere of our understanding of what do we mean by news becoming political. What do we mean by the politicization of news? Why is it today that we are getting worried that more and more news outlets are owned by politicians? For many years, when the history of the freedom struggle was written, one of the key points, or strong points which came out was the fact that politicians were involved very closely in newsmaking, right from Nehru Senior in a sense. So why today are we worried about the politicization of news production? Besides very explicit shaping of the way news reaches us, there have been two other concerns. One, of course, has been, as far as television is concerned, the ownership of news outlets, both at the level of producing news, which means broadcasters, the news channels, and at the level of distribution of news, which is the pipes. And I'll talk more about that later on. Examples are here. For example, it happened in last year. There was a TV channel which was carrying a documentary against certain mining interests in Karnataka, and in those areas, those news were blanked out. This is not something peculiar to Karnataka. It happens all over the country. It happens in Punjab on a regular basis. It's been happening in Bengal and Tamil Nadu and so on and so forth. So the politicization of news not only means a more explicit shaping of news, but a more intrusive blackout of news. So in a sense, news not allowing to be reached to its audiences seem to be getting more important than actually a spin in a particular kind of news. The other issue there is in terms of the way in which allowing or not allowing certain kinds of interests to emerge in the news fields are being shaped. And of course, this links to the issue of licensing. Who is a legitimate authority to produce and distribute news? Is the licensing procedure transparent, accountable, and so on and so forth? And there have been severe issues there, both at the state and the national level, which the report talks about. Coming to the sort of key issue of the sort of topic which I have given here in terms of the set-top box. Why do I need to buy a set-top box suddenly? Those of us who are not in certain pockets of the 3 or 4 large cities, I think for the first time have bought set-top boxes over the last 6 weeks. I don't know how many people in Bangalore have moved to buying a set-top box over the last 8 weeks, given the kind of deadlines which are being forced by the government here. So I think there are sort of more stated official reasons why we should all invest in a set-top box for our television sets. There are certain unstated reasons which sort of lie behind that, and of course there are certain more things which we need to know as to why this kind of transition is taking place. I think for me the set-top box stands as an object and at another level a metaphor for the kind of transitions which are being made today as far as the television world is concerned. Briefly, what used to happen at one point of time for those of us who grew up with watching Doordarshan was the fact that we had a television set and we had an antenna which looked like a rusted hanger through which all of us in different parts of the country were able to catch whatever comes out from New Delhi. So in a sense that was the very first phase through which television kind of emerged here, that there was one broadcaster which was sending a signal across, sort of almost spraying a signal which was freely tappable by anybody who had a kind of a crude antenna, and we were able to watch that kind of programming. With the emergence of cable and satellite broadcasting about 20 years ago, we found a sort of different mode through which we can, in a sense, engage with television, a different way in which television entered into our houses. And this is of course initially through cable, and more recently in the last 10 years through DTH systems, in a sense wireless systems. The problem of course with cable seemed to have been that there were technological issues in terms of the kind of reception which were different in different parts of the country. But after about 15 years of having cable, a need was felt to try and refine this process of distributing news, in a sense. And this refinement, in a sense, had different kinds of explanations or different kind of rationales there. So at one level the rationale was that the quality of the signal which is being distributed by our local cable operators is not good enough. It's not doing justice to the quality of signals which are being produced and distributed by the broadcasters. So there was a certain understanding of what a quality signal is. And therefore, of course, quite clearly the local cable operators were to blame for that. It's the local cable operators who are not investing in a certain kind of technological upgradation, which has then led to a decline, in a sense, in the standards of what we watch and what we hear. There was also an argument that the revenues which come from the cable operators, in a sense the rents which we pay every month for cable, that's shared between 3 entities. It's shared with the cable operator, the distributor network, with the broadcasters who provide these programs, and of course it's shared by the government as well. And therefore this whole sense, an idea of under-declaration started emerging, is that the local cable operators are under-declaring the number of subscribers that are there in a particular pocket, which therefore meant that the broadcasters got a smaller amount of money as far as their share is concerned, which also of course made the government realize that if the broadcasters are getting a smaller share of their money, they are also getting a smaller share of tax or at least what was considered to be legitimate tax. So the sense, the development of television distribution reached a scenario whereby nearly everybody in the food chain thought that they were being shortchanged. And the blame, in a sense, was being put on the local cable operators. With the emergence of DTH technology and the way it was sort of brought in here, there was a sense of change which was perceived. And essentially what happens in DTH is that there is a direct connection between me, the viewer, and the distributor who owns the satellite, who is distributing these programs, and of course the broadcaster. So that food chain, in a sense, got completely compressed. Instead of having a series of intermediaries through which these signals produced from broadcasting stations reached our house, it was a sort of a one-stop scenario, whereby the signals are produced, news is produced from studios, is beamed up to satellites, through which it then comes down directly through dishes which are loaded in our houses and so on and so forth. Yeah. So this sort of compressed sense of the food chain gave an idea of, sort of an exaggerated idea of the kind of leaks which were taking place in the earlier sort of food chain. And the reason which was given was that this compressed food chain, in a sense, is a product of digital technologies. So if the TV signals are digitized and distributed through a particular kind of technological protocol, the food chain gets compressed, the intermediaries get removed, and therefore all stakeholders throughout that food chain tends to benefit the most. The idea, of course, was if this can happen with DTH technology, can it happen with cable as well? Or do we continue with these two totally different kinds of technologies? One with the compressed food chain, where one can clearly make an idea of who the number of subscribers are, or this more complicated intermediary-led sort of food chain where there is kind of leakage at all different levels. The government started thinking about this quite seriously over about 4 years ago. And one of the concerns was not the quality of signal which I get in my house or what you get in your house, was the fact that the government seemed to be, in a sense, running out of sources of revenue. And with the sort of auction of the spectrum which happened in 2010, there was a more concerted look at all communication industries as the new milch cow. And therefore the idea was that if there are about 100 million television households in this country, is the government able to maximize the kind of taxes from those 100 million households? And the only way that could have been done is by technically identifying which those 100 million households are, which in a sense then became the main driver towards digitization. In our earlier system which we had, our old sort of cable operation systems, there was no idea in terms of the number of houses which were connected to a particular cable operator. The kinds of channels which each one of us watched were also opaque in a sense, and how much of each particular channel which we watched was also opaque. And the solution, of course, to all this lay in this magic box called the set-top box. So the set-top box gave a very accurate idea of who is watching what and who is watching how much. And besides what's being broadcast by the television stations, there could be other kind of services which could be also piped through these set-top boxes. Internet systems being one of them, movies on demand, games, and so on and so forth. So in a sense, in this search for trying to enumerate and identify the number of people who are actually watching television, do we see the emergence of the government's policy of digitization of cable, or what often is called the digital switchover. In Bangalore, the first phase happened on 31st of March. I don't know whether there were riots here, whether there was discussion before that, and so on and so forth. In many other cities, this sort of mandatory digitization has led to a large amount of conflict, not only amongst conflict in legal terms, amongst sort of certified stakeholders, but also led to conflicts in the streets, especially in places like Bombay and Calcutta. The implications of having therefore a set-top box was that, and again this is going by what we see in the first phase of the switchover. Yes, there has been a sense that a large amount of leaks of revenue have been plugged because there's a greater sense of who these audiences are. The idea was that as broadcasters get a larger share of their revenues, it was hoped that they will reinvest their increasing shares into quality programming. Evidence in the first phase of the digital switchover over the last 6 months has shown that broadcasters have been unwilling to do that. And that's largely because the broadcasters have been bleeding over the last 4 or 5 years for different reasons. So therefore, the second stated objective of having a set-top box, i.e. that if you have a set-top box, there will be more legitimate sources of revenue going for the broadcaster, who might then invest that kind of revenue into producing better programming for us, has also not unfolded. I think the one who's really benefiting from this switchover, of course, is the government. If we have a rough estimate of even 20 rupees per month per set-top box in terms of which is going as tax to the government, and if there are close to 100 million households in this country today, that gives a very, very large amount of monthly tax which is going to the government. So in a sense, like the auctioning of spectrum, the forced switchover in cable is also proving to be largely a financial boon to the government, and a financial boon whose cost we are bearing as viewers. What was promised to us as viewers, besides better quality signals? We were promised that there would be a greater amount of choice. So there was a certain discourse of choice started emerging, that we could actually try and pick the kind of channels which we wanted to, and not pay for the channel which we don't want. That again seems to have not unfolded according to the script. And that's largely because the way in which these channels are distributed as what we call bundles. So in a sense, if I have to go and buy capsicum as a vegetable, I can't buy capsicum separately. I buy capsicum together with a bunch of other vegetables which I might like or not like. So this whole sense of bundling a bunch of programs, while it has made these programs relatively more economical, it has taken away that sense of choice which was promised as part of the digitization. The other thing seems to be a bit more serious, and I think one could sort of talk more about that given the nature of the audiences here, is a certain kind of technological grip within which we are sort of falling into. Typically, these set-top boxes are not compatible with different vendors, which means if I am staying in one particular area and I have a set-top box and I have Tata Sky, if I don't like the choice being offered by Tata Sky and I want to switch to another vendor like Airtel, for instance, I can't do that without buying an Airtel's set-top box. And in a sense, this sort of reminds me of the another kind of transition which is being attempted, at least in some parts of the country, of these light bulbs. And there was attempt to try and have a mandatory switchover, which is there in Delhi, from the old tungsten bulbs to the new CFL bulbs. And that switchover, in a sense, can take place because the sockets holding the bulbs are the same. In this case, the equivalent of the socket, which is the set-top box, that itself is under contention. So not only am I able to not economically enforce my sense of choice because of bundling of these programs, but even in terms of technology, it's not being made feasible for me. So if I move from one vendor to another vendor, if I move often from one format, which is cable, to DTH, I have to bear those incremental costs as far as the set-top box is concerned. And therefore, all avenues of me exercising choice, both in terms of price and in terms of technology, have been taken away from me. So when we actually sign up for one set-top box, we've actually signed up with one company for the rest of our lives. Unless, of course, we want to make those incremental investments in switching. So our switchover costs, or our cost to exercise choice, have increased tremendously. And this, in a sense, goes fundamentally against what was promised, normatively at least, as far as the digital switchover is concerned. It also goes against the idea of competition which in a sense the current government seems to be proposing here. So they are, I mean, this is looked upon largely as an anti-competitive move as far as the government is concerned. These matters, I am sure, in the next 6 months themselves are going to be looked at by various commissions there. So this in a sense seems to be one way in which a transition which is being forced upon us is not living up to what we were being promised. There is something which is a bit more insidious which is also happening. It may not be very, very directly relevant to many of us here who watch cable television, but a similar kind of transition is being thought of as far as Doordarshan is concerned. Doordarshan actually broadcasts a signal which is what's called free to air. I can receive the signal with this old hanger which I have here. What is happening is that even Doordarshan is thinking of another way in which to transmit its signal. It is trying to digitize its own transmission signal, which means a different kind of set-top box would be required to receive those signals. If my house has a cable television, then obviously I get Doordarshan through cable. But if I am staying in a remote area where there is no cable, where there is no DTH, and my only source of news is Doordarshan, electronic news is Doordarshan or All India Radio, by 2017, I will have to invest in a set-top box in order to try and decode the signal being pushed by Doordarshan. So even if I have an old battered All India Radio radio set, to listen to All India Radio, I have to possibly invest at least something 10 times the price of the radio in that set-top box. So Doordarshan only households, AIR only households or remote areas which can't afford cable are again going to take a hit, which basically means that a very important public service is being denied to a large number of citizens here. So there's a certain kind of disenfranchisement which will be taking place. Of course, this process is unfolding over a longer period of time as far as the cable switchover is concerned. The entire transition is over 2 years. Every 6 months, a large number of cities have to undergo this mandatory transition. As far as Doordarshan is concerned, this transition would happen over 5 years. So what you might find is by July 2017, a large number of households would be disenfranchised, both in terms of being unable to try and have the resources to have access cable television, and those who are not in cable and DTH loops completely blank out their access to Doordarshan. Yeah. Which of course brings us to the idea or the relevance of the public broadcaster. In many sectors, of course, the public sector entities are not quite required. But if in a sense we try and equate the public broadcaster or even the state-run broadcaster the way it exists right now as providing very fundamental entitlements, fundamental information entitlements, however biased those entitlements might be, what does it mean if one day nobody is able to receive any television? So there is a sense of those of us who are able to receive television with highly biased, slanted or homogeneous kind of viewpoints. Yeah. But there is another reality which is also emerging, is that we are not able to receive any kind of electronic information. And that day is not really far behind. There are challenges of that, not only to households having access to Doordarshan, but also I think community radio broadcasters in a sense are also quite concerned by that. Largely because people in a sense who would be listening to community radio would then have to buy another kind of set to listen to normal radio sets. Yeah. So there seems to be a cascading effect of this rather unthought or hasty move into digitization. Yeah. And this is sort of complicate the entire information ecology within which we are living. Those of us who will be investing to partake in this transition will have to be bearing costs which are incremental over a period of time, because there are multiple costs involved. Despite bearing those costs, the kind of choices which are at hand won't be delivered. And of course, the stakeholders, as in those who are at higher levels of the food chain, are going to constantly accumulate more and more money. So it's moving towards an environment whereby media freedom as a whole seems to get stifled there, both at the level of choice, at the level of demand, and therefore also at the level of supply. those who are going to supply information or this kind of information will also be decreasing. Because cable digitization, coming back to the first point, is a highly expensive process. Globally, it's been done through debt. So companies take debt, governments take debt to undergo this transition. In India, this entire is not happening through debt. All of us are being forced to pay these set-top boxes. So imagine 100 million households in the end of 2 years buying a set-top box minimum at the price of 1,000 rupees. So we are publicly financing this switchover, whose benefits, both immediate and long-term, financial and non-financial, are being gained completely by the companies together with the government. And this, in a sense, is one side of our move towards a digital future, which seems to have been rather undocumented. So in a sense, the report is trying to capture this, at the same time to try and see whether the positives which are being accrued from telecommunications and from internet to some extent can actually overturn, or if not address, the gaps being left in this. So essentially we are moving into a scenario whereby by 2017 possibly the number of cell phone houses and the number of internet houses might have increased, but the number of broadcasting radio and television households might be going down. In that scenario, I don't quite know which is old media and which is new media. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Vibhor. We have time for like a really quick kind of responses or questions if people have any, but only if you like really dying for it. Yes, I can pass the mic.
You just stand close to each other because you'll ask and I'll answer. So you have to. Yeah. I think the 94 judgment, this whole idea of the right to public, I was wondering whether it's been locked into the idea, too much attention of the right of public through broadcast, and in that process the right of the public to receive seems to have sort of started withering away. So, sorry? Yeah, I think the way I see it is that there were not enough protocols built in that to ensure that while there is an expansion in the rights of those who can broadcast, there may not necessarily be equal protections for those people who can receive. So that for me seems to be a bit of a lopsided kind of thing. And what you are right, implicitly it means that the right to receive would lead to a certain kind of right to broadcast. But the way in which the broadcasting has happened has changed dramatically since 94, and therefore the gap of right to receive seems to have emerged much more than what we thought earlier. So yeah, and that's I think largely because the distribution segment, the cable and DTH segment, has grown in an independent way to become an entity which is not at all envisaged in 94. So the whole shift from the kernel of the industry from broadcasting to distribution, that shift in a sense has led to this sort of a gap which we are trying to deal with in a sense, and which is not the case with telecom and internet, because they're directly, I mean the relationship is there without intermediaries. between so-called broadcasters or between two sets of people who are talking here.
Are there any other questions or responses, or anybody wants to chip in?
Good question.
Yes.
How do you mean when you say digitalization globally has been sort of
Debt, yeah.
How do you mean?
So, when we are moving towards the digital infrastructure, say there's an analog infrastructure which exists, that has to be over a period of time reshaped into digital infrastructure. Who will pay for this? Traditionally, for major shifts in technology, the government was bankrolling it, okay, and therefore there's a certain idea of welfare and so on and so forth. Whereas this shift has come at a time when the cost to reshape the infrastructure is humongous. Okay, the governments are not interested in bankrolling this any longer, and that's largely because a large part of broadcasting has moved out of the hands of the government. Except for countries which have still a strong public broadcast tradition, Japan, Sweden, Finland, England, so on and so forth, the public broadcaster is not interested in this. And therefore, it's private companies, the corporations, who are actually going to bankroll this transition. Either these companies are cash rich, and therefore they can spend billions of dollars for which they start getting returns in 5 years, 10 years, and so on and so forth. Or they go to the market and they raise money to finance this transition, which in a sense moves into debt. The way it's happened, of course, here is that we are the ones who are paying for this transition. So the companies are not raising debt. They are getting cash immediately, every month in that sense. The government is not spending on it, the government is gaining on it. Okay? There are no safeguards to ensure what the government is gaining is partly being used to subsidize, for example, set-top boxes to those of us who cannot afford it. Okay? So we are financing, in a sense, our own transition into a system where we may not be, many of us may not be able to take part in it. So partly digging our own grave, in a sense. So we're actually paying for somebody to dig our own grave, partly, unless we decide to cremate ourselves.
Okay, we have time for like one last comment or question before I kind of step in.
I actually overheard some people in the afternoon talking about set-top boxes with Kiran outside, and there were some interesting questions there in terms of accessibility and so on and so forth. I don't recognize who the other people were besides. Yeah. This is very interesting. First of all, I mean, beginning with Tamil Nadu, when this first thing happened of television sets, it shows in a sense that television or certain kind of media devices are like basic entitlements. They're like rice and drinking water and so on and so forth. So this whole idea of looking at information infrastructure at the device level as entitlements, which is not recognized legally or constitutionally or even ideologically at other levels, is being recognized at a very practical level by politicians. And then that has extended from devices of television to distribution devices. So nobody is saying that I'll give you a mobile phone. Okay, 40 years ago, nobody promised, and Anna Zurai, for example, did not promise a phone in a sense, but it's not really promised television set, cinema houses and so on and so forth. So I think this idea of trying to make political capital out of a certain kind of information capital is something which in a sense reflects our move towards digital age. As far as providing these things free are concerned, again it's something which is going to come from the public exchequer, which means again it's coming from us here. So whether we are buying it over the counter or whether some politician gives it to me free of cost in lieu possibly of votes, in both cases I'm paying. And that again, this whole idea of a public subsidy of private enterprise starts coming in a sense. To what extent should public money subsidize private profits? So that for me is a very strange sort of scenario here. Yeah. Yeah, I think depending upon if distribution technologies will increase, will change over a period of time. We might move completely from a sort of mangled wire situation to a complete wireless situation. But in all cases, there would be some sort of reception interface would be required. Okay, if that reception interface is not interoperable across vendors, if it's not interoperable across platforms, the problems might still remain. So in a sense, the heart of this whole thing is actually the set-top box there. And the telecom industry has sort of sorted that out by going in for two parallel formats, for instance. Yeah. And there are tremendous problems even in that as well there. But I think the idea of a set-top box representing a kind of encrypted device mandatorily required for reception will remain everywhere there. And therefore, problems over defining those protocols will also remain there. Since I'm not selling them, I can sort of promise very long lives. Yeah, I don't know right now. Okay, because the qualities have really not been tested. The oldest set-top boxes in operation are now 10 years old, because in parts of South Delhi, South Bombay, and South Madras, when there was mandatory move to set-top boxes in 2003, those set-top boxes are still surviving. Okay, and I wonder whether the life of the set-top box, if it has a longer life, it might reduce the cost. New technology. Yeah. So I think there the interesting thing is the price actually. You know, how are these things priced? So for example, as say Delhi, Bombay, Chennai and Calcutta, as we were moving towards the first transition on 31st of October, the price of the set-top box was actually rising. It began at 1,000 rupees and in the last 2 days, they sold over 1 lakh set-top boxes at around 4,000 rupees a box. The same box I bought in December for less than 1,000 rupees. So I think this idea of the life of the box and indexing the price to the life is again a very artificial kind of scenario. You know, if I'm going by price per year, again, I mean, if you have other kind of interfaces, whether it's an IPTV box or so on and so forth, how are these things priced? Can they be outpriced? Okay, so for example, very often the government's rhetoric has been against Chinese products coming into India, and here for the first time, quietly, the government has been happy that the Chinese are exporting very cheap set-top boxes to India because domestic manufacturing capacity is not able to meet the transition. So strange kind of alliances are being built between those who are importing Chinese equipment, who are otherwise not allowed to import other kind of possible equipment, to serve this kind of purpose in a sense. But of course, my question is, who's paying for this at the end of the day? Whether it's 500 rupees or whether it's 3,000 rupees, who's paying for this? And once we make that cost, who's actually going to mince these costs recurrently over a longer period of time?
So there was a question there, but I just wanted to kind of piggyback a little bit on that. But isn't the life question also an obsolescence question? Right, in terms that like the transition from the VCR to the MP3 player and the MP3 player to the iPad and things like that, the ways in which if you invest in a set-top box now is only going to mean that you're constantly going to now buy an upgraded version of the set-top box as technologies change as well?
Yeah, unless of course I move laterally. So I can move two ways. Either I can buy better quality set-top boxes which keep me logged into the same vendor, Or as I get dissatisfied by one vendor, I move to another vendor, and while moving laterally, I buy a better box there. As of now, the second thing seems to be happening because people are getting very, I mean, I was talking to somebody this morning, I was saying that on Airtel, so-and-so stuff is not coming. Okay, so you have to migrate. What is interesting here, of course, is that, and this is a little heavy thing I should have mentioned earlier, is that Prasar Bharati, Doordarshan, they also have their own set-top box. Okay, that set-top box is of course priced at a lower level. That service actually is free, so we have to just pay for the set-top box. We don't have to pay for monthly rents. The argument there, of course, we don't have to pay monthly rents is because the kinds of channels who have signed up with Doordarshan are trash channels. Yeah. Okay, but I think there's something more there. The set-top box which is being pushed by Doordarshan actually is an open box. Yeah.
So you can hack into it and
No. It's open in terms of it's compatible with all vendors. Yeah. And that's quite interesting. Both the middleware and the hardware itself are compatible across vendors. Yeah. Which sort of leads to the question as to one argument, therefore, that this is an example of public interest. So the public service broadcaster is pushing a set-top box which is compatible to all other kinds of devices, service providers, and therefore in marginal areas and so on and so forth, it sort of helps. The other argument there is that actually by giving out these free set-top boxes, it is cushioning the access of the most marginalized to private services. Okay, so again, it seems to be an argument of public subsidy towards enhancing that. That one I don't know how it's going to play out actually, because I wouldn't like to sort of really make any strong comments on that. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm going to be a taskmaster a little bit. So there's one last question and then we need to move into the next segment because eventually we also want you to eat dinner. And we're both going to be around, so we are going to have conversations. Okay, last two questions then, please, not more than that. But there's someone here first and then you. Yes.
With the expansion of internet and mobile media as a means of distribution and accession that people have, it's giving them the choice that set-top boxes were supposed to in regards to downloading the content that you want and not more. You're paying for what you want and you're not having to do that. What is the impact of that, the emergence of this on a set-top box? When you don't need to have a set-top box, you just plug your TV into your computer or something like that and you download what you want. That takes it out of the picture completely.
Absolutely. So I think the other questions are largely coming.
Along with that, what happens when in a market like this, when it's publicly funded, as you say, people just say no, I'm not going to do that. Like, what happens to like the revenues and broadcasts then?
Sorry, the second part I was not clear. What people say no to what?
If it's on the people's backs to pay for it,
Mhm.
what if they just say no?
You don't get any TV.
We have that. Well, we have internet. We can watch TV on
Yeah.
our phone.
So then we're talking about houses which don't have internet, or at least broadband in the sense to access television, and are outside, equivalents of 3G kind of stuff to watch that. And those houses are still very large. Okay. So I think there are two kinds of debates here in terms of the what ifs in a sense. What if in terms of is telecom, internet versus television? So that's what if is the future, internet, telecom rather than television broadcasting. So we talk more about this sort of post-broadcast world and so on and so forth. But there's also what if within the television business itself, which in a sense I'm talking about. Given the kind of current spreads of demography, given the exorbitant costs of 4G, large amount of rural areas or even semi-urban areas, I mean, television is increasingly getting concentrated outside those cities where you don't have internet and telecom. Yeah. So we are having this demography sort of moving in a very strange kind of way. So I think once you start talking about those 80 million households which do not have access to high quality broadband and telecom devices good enough to choose live streaming. Again, to end it at a more pessimistic note, the many companies who are distributing TV content through DTH also have the rights to the content over telecom. So I think these issues of accumulating interests, either in terms of money or in terms of content, will still remain there. And that's why it's not surprising more and more telecom companies are getting into distributing television there. Not because they like television, because they're possibly looking 10 years ahead.
Okay, one last question, and I'll have to ask you to be very loud because we can't hear you.
Well, again, I think two ways also depending upon who's paying for that. So yes, interactive services are growing through both through DTH and through cable as well. But again, that's largely sort of commercial services. So it's not that the user can broadcast. It's not two-way in that sense. Yeah. But I mean two-way in terms of things like interactive games. Okay. So that kind of two-way is in a sense what the promise of this technology is. But two-way in terms of can the recipients also broadcast using those devices themselves is not seem to be happening here, technologically and of course legally as well. So yeah, I mean there are a bunch of YouTube how-to videos in terms of trying to hack into set-top boxes to try and possibly share signals within a particular, because the idea is that if all the set-top boxes are connected in one kind of network, is it possible that within that network at least information can move? Yeah. This is being tried out at certain places. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. So in a sense, that's happening. One way is happening through text, so Twitter and those questions like that. Of course, I think the problem there is that most of these questions which are being posed to the newsroom, which we see on TV, are actually coming from the newsroom itself. Yeah. So I think that little industry might collapse if this option is given of us actually asking questions. But yes, I mean this is happening in many parts of the world on local stations, where so the idea of the phone in is getting reversed in a sense. People are actually asking questions on that. The potential of digital terrestrial transmission also provides this in a sense. Yeah. But that's not seem to be on the Doordarshan agenda, right? In terms of set-top boxes, yeah, I mean it's an ideal device in a sense to try and gather who's watching kind of what, which is being in a sense already being used by those who are measuring viewership and so on and so forth. Yeah. So those who are measuring viewership, so that's a sort of a surveillance device in a sense purely in terms of who's watching how much and what. If those stamp people meters also have a little camera built into it, that could make it even more interesting. Yeah.
The motto is we're watching Big Brother.
Yeah, watching Big Brother.
Yes. Okay, on that note, before anybody wants to ask 5 more questions disguised as one, I'm going to ask you to join me in thanking you both for this extraordinary talk.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we are going to quickly segue into from theoretical talks to more visual presentations. And I think while we set up the videos, I must ask this question, which I have asked in many public forums before. When was the last time you went to a cyber cafe? Okay, who here in the last month went to a cyber cafe? What were the kind of illegal activities you wanted to do? Because I remember in the last 6 months, and I've been kind of tracking it, right? I've been to a cyber cafe 3 times. The first time was because I was in somewhere in East Asia and I needed to download material which, let's say, was error English. It was basically no, actually, American